the Americans and Westerners in general fundamentally misunderstand what is going on in Syria or what can happen there. That this is not a democratic revolution by any means, and that if the Assad regime falls, that whatever comes afterward will be hostile to the West, will be hostile to Russia, and that essentially they feel that they have a far better understanding of what's going on in Syria than, say, the Obama administration, or at least their belief as what the Obama administration thinks about it, and that they don't have what they see as the Obama administration's rosy expectations of democratization. In other words, so change in government in Syria is not going to lead to democracy. It's not going to lead to something better. It's going to lead to something worse, and worse for everyone. And surely this is obvious. Another reason why the Russians seem to be so supportive of Syria is they don't really see a great cost in opposing the U.S. on this. That they, I think according to their lights, in fact, they don't see the U.S. as very serious about Syria. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to alliterate there, serious about Syria. Probably not the first one to do that. In that the Obama administration is essentially calling for UN Security Council economic sanctions against the Assad regime. Well, what the Russians understand is that economic sanctions work very slowly, if at all. I mean, the ones against Cuba are not exactly, still have yet to come to fruition. That if the U.S. was serious about change in Syria, that it would do what it always does, and that is assemble a coalition of the willing and militarily intervene and basically present the Russians with the choice of support us in the Security Council or not. We're going in. That the U.S. has a history, as does Russia, of acting outside of the UN Security Council. We've done it before, and they know we can do it again. Therefore, the fact that we're not doing it shows them that we really aren't serious. That by calling for economic sanctions, what they see the Obama administration as doing as attempting to be seen to do something about Syria, while in fact not doing anything. And that there are good reasons for the Obama administration not to do anything about Syria. One is that the Israeli government in particular has made clear that it does not see the possibility of change in Syria. It's not focusing on how things might be better. It's definitely focusing on how things might be worse. And that there are many, the Israelis see the downfall of the Assad regime, even though the Assad regime has clearly been no friend of Israel's, as harming Israel. In other words, that Israel is better off with the continuation of the Assad regime, and as the Russians understand, that the Israelis have some means to persuade American policymakers of their point of view. The other thing, of course, is simply American domestic politics. That Americans are weary of the wars that they have become engaged in this part of the world. They don't want another one. The Obama administration in particular doesn't want to see another war in an election year, and probably not afterwards. And that while the Republicans, or certain Republicans, might claim that they would be more inclined to intervene, that when it comes down to it, if we have a new Republican administration, that if anything, they're going to be more sensitive to Israeli concerns about Syria than the Obama administration is. So they don't see the American political system as calling for this. And if the Americans want to blame Russia for not being able to do anything about Syria, then that's actually good as far as Moscow is concerned, because that makes Russia look like it's powerful and important, even though it might not be. And so if we act like they are, then maybe they are. So I think that, in other words, they don't see us as the principal instigator, shall we say, and that's how they view it, in Syria. And that brings me to the third motivation that the Russians have. In other words, that then if the U.S. is not really bringing about change in Syria, then who is? And they do have targets to blame, and this is Saudi Arabia in particular, as well as Qatar. Sort of, in other words, what they see is a grand Sunni effort to spread, Saudi influence, Sunni influence to Syria. Now, I want to back up just a little bit. It's a little over a decade ago, fall of 2001, the Middle East Institute's Michael Collins Dunn was kind enough to publish an article of mine in the Middle East Journal on the Saudi-Russian relationship, in which I talked about the really almost primordial fears that the Russians have of Saudi Arabia, that we tend to think of Saudi Arabia as a conservative power. The Russians back then thought of Saudi Arabia as a revolutionary power, that they blamed the problems they were experiencing in Chechnya and in the North Caucasus in general on Saudi action, Saudi support for Chechen rebels. They frequently claimed before 9/11 that in fact Saudi Arabia supported Al-Qaeda, and they regarded 9/11 as the chance to finally, pull the wool from America's eyes to see what the true nature of Saudi Arabia actually was. Now, of course, Russian-American relations would not be so good for so long, but you'll remember that during this brief period, especially late 2001, 2002, Putin himself never tired of reminding the world, and America in particular, that 15 of the 19 bombers came from Saudi Arabia. Well, you know what that means, don't you? That there was that Saudi Arabia is the enemy. So this was their view of Saudi Arabia, and that basically that they were intending to spread radical Sunni Islamism throughout the Middle East and throughout the Muslim world up into Russia as well as elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. Now, this changed in 2003 with the Saudi-Russian rapprochement, that as Russian-American relations deteriorated, Saudi-American relations were not so good at this point. It was actually an initiative of Crown Prince Abdullah in particular. He went to Moscow. This was the highest level Saudi visit to Russia ever. And basically what the Saudis seemed to have convinced the Russians was that, in fact, they did not support the independence of these small, weak, violent states in the North Caucasus, that they were willing to accept the Russian solution for them. And in fact, the Saudis have done this almost too well. In other words, they have basically, welcomed the Kadyrovs, in other words, the former Chechen rebels with whom Putin cut a deal with to essentially run Chechnya for them. They can do anything they want, and they do, except for declare independence. That Ramzan Kadyrov, who in many respects, qualifies as a psychopath, who claims to have instituted Islamic rule in Chechnya, has been welcomed to Riyadh and accepted as a good Muslim leader, etc. It's really quite amazing. Anyway, the Saudi-Russian relationship seemed to take off. Putin himself visited Riyadh in 2007. He also visited Qatar and Jordan at that particular time. The Russians seemed to be hoping that there would be, that Saudi resentment of the United States would lead to Russian arms sales to Saudi Arabia, Russian investment in the Saudi oil sector, gas sector, every sector you can imagine. They hope to build railroads in Saudi Arabia. It's really just their hopes were amazing. And of course, it'd be Saudi investment in Russia. And it didn't quite come off this way. the Saudis made clear it was that their interpretation of one of the things that bothers Saudi Arabia, you may have heard, is Iran and the threat from Iran. And they're very unhappy that the Russians support the Iranian nuclear program as well as their, sell weapons to them. The Saudi view of Russia's motives was that they were strictly commercial. In other words, that why were they selling arms to Iran? Well, because they didn't have many customers. Iran was one. The Saudi solution seemed to be that, well, we know how to deal with that. We'll buy far more than the Iranians are buying from you. You just stop selling to Iran, and we'll take up the slack and more. You'd think the Russians would accept that, but no, they did not. They don't want that. What they want to be able to do is to sell to everyone. What they want is not the Saudi solution, but the UAE solution. The UAE has issues with Iran. Russia sells arms to Iran. The UAE buys lots of arms from Iran. That's what they want the Saudis to also do. You have difficulties with your neighbors? You don't like that we sell arms to them? We'll sell arms to you too. And that would be their solution. The Saudis have not accepted that. Now, what has happened is that there has been sort of slowly over the past couple of years, it seems that whenever there's a Putin visit anywhere, that the initial expectation is, the Russian relations with this country are really now close. But in almost every case that he's visited the Middle East, what has happened is the opposite, that Putin came to visit, expectations ran high, and then they were never fulfilled, that in fact the relationship in fact tended to sour. But they have really soured now in the wake of the Arab Spring, or I guess Arab uprising. I'm not quite sure if there's a correct term for this. I know that some of my colleagues don't like the term Arab Spring, but anyway, it seems to be the popularly accepted terminology. That the Russians have come to the conclusion that Saudi Arabia, in particular, along with Qatar, is attempting to hijack the Arab Spring. And as evidence, they point to Saudi support on the Salafist Party in Egypt, which has done very, very well, Saudi support for Islamist allies in Libya, that the Saudis are very much involved in the solution that has been achieved in Yemen, but in Syria in particular, what they see as Saudi Arabia is attempting to take advantage of the unrest to bring down the Alawite minority regime allied to Iran and to replace it with a regime that is beholden to Saudi Arabia. And that this is what they're doing. And the question is, do the Americans understand this or not? Now, Russian views of Saudi Arabia, we might argue, many of us might argue that in fact the Russians simply don't understand what Saudi Arabia, what its motives are or what it's trying to do. And then, I haven't even touched on the Russian-Qatar relationship, and this has been an extremely difficult relationship over the past several years. That Russia regards Qatar in particular as a competitor in the natural gas market, one in which Qatar has competitive advantages compared to Russia, and that it doesn't cooperate with at all. And the Qataris have reason not to like the Russians, especially when they assassinated, one of the former Chechen president on Qatari territory several years back. In any event, is their fear of Saudi Arabia rational? Is their characterization of what the Saudis are trying to achieve in Syria rational? Well, I guess the way I think to think about it is that this is what they think. It's not a question of whether it's accurate or not. And I think that the way to do it is that just as the United States tends to be very fearful of Iran, Russia does not. They don't see Iran as such a powerful state. They don't even see Iran, a nuclear Iran, as being that much of a problem. I mean, after all, it's not nearly as bad as a nuclear Pakistan, for God's sake. And that you know, nothing that that sort of